Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We are here for another one of your questions about work. And this one is one where I'm going to do it solo because, for understandable reasons, while many leaders face this question, sadly and unfortunately, it's a hard one to identify that you're thinking about and talking about. And that's a reason why it makes sense for me to talk about it. For those of you who are here for the first time, I'm Roy. I'm a startup investor in the future of work. And we've had this question come up a handful of times over the years, which is, how do I do layoffs? And when I was a CEO, had to do layoffs twice. And so I'm going to skip the question of whether you need to do layoffs, which is an essential question. And I'm going to assume that because of some economic necessity, you have some cut that you need to make to your headcount of your company. And the first thing I'll notice is that the language around layoffs tends to be really clinical. And I recommend avoiding clinical language because it detaches you from the human side of it. People call it a RIF, a reduction in force, as if, it's like some military operation. And the first thing is just get in touch with the fact you're about to go through something that for you, but much, much more importantly, for those who are impacted, could be really grueling. The weird thing about our modern world is that depending what industry you're in, depending on the occupations where you're laying people off, I've seen cases where everybody had a job or almost everybody had a job a week later getting paid more. And so whether to do layoffs, I'm kind of skipping how much of a layoff to do, where, by the way, headline on that is once you've decided you need to do a layoff, everybody underdoes it. So you have to find ways to correct for that. Nobody believes their company will actually be better off with many fewer people, and that it often ends up that way. But I'm going to assume those are given and that it's more of a question of how. So let's assume you have a target for how much cost you have to cut or how many people you need to get rid of. And the first thing to do is to figure out who. Then you'll plan how exactly you'll execute on it. Figuring it out who depends a lot on the size of the organization. Sometimes you're not the CEO doing it. You're the person who runs a team doing it. And I'd invite, by the way, if there are any comments people want to make, while we're live, I'll definitely try to take the questions and incorporate them. But the first question is, who do you want to include in the decision? And I think about people who their ability after the layoff, your goal is a good company after the layoff and humane treatment of the people who are being laid off. And I'd think about who, if they weren't included in the decision, it would negatively impact their ability to continue to work with you effectively. Well, you left me out of this choice. I can't do my job without deciding who. And in some companies, you end up going down several levels of management. And yes, it ends up getting out sometimes that this is happening. And so, you want to try to control that if you can, but it's more important to make a good decision than it is to avoid gossip swirls, which means another implication is go fast. Try to make the decision as rapidly as possible. I've seen it happen within a day. And people say, I can't possibly decide this in a day. Sometimes an imperfect decision made quickly is better than a perfect decision made slowly. But you have to go fast. And then as far as guidance on who to choose, well, there I think about what will leave the company in the best possible position afterward, or the organization in the best possible position afterward. You have to decide certain functions. Sometimes it's like, well, we just don't have enough for the salespeople to do, so we got to ask the salespeople to go. Sometimes it's like our product's pretty built, and even though it's really hard to recruit engineers, and sometimes, by the way, especially in Silicon Valley, an unrecoverable error in terms of your company's reputation in the market, you got to sometimes get rid of engineers. I would always keep an eye to making sure the company that the company is as diverse as you wish it to be after the layoff. Oftentimes, people from communities that are underestimated get short shrift in layoffs. And so you want to be careful and counteract that. And I'm also leaving aside, by the way, you You will want to be in touch with your HR person and possibly with lawyers, because many states have rules around how the notifications work and who can be laid off. And so I'm going to just assume you have your legal side buttoned up, and I'm talking more about the organizational and management side. And so then you have a list. What I wouldn't think about is sometimes people are tempted to say, well, this person might react really negatively. You can't make decisions based on what somebody's reactions are going to be. And then it comes to planning how the layoffs will actually take place. And there are different styles for how to do this. My core recommendation is you have to treat people with as much respect as possible and move as rapidly as possible. A good layoff can be communicated end to end within just a few hours. Um, and uh, and the communication plan, you have to think about all the constituencies. So you for sure have to think about the people who are laid off. And Mike Meyer, who's been a guest here on the show and is extraordinary as a consumer goods and other industries executive and now private equity investor, names another critical constituency, which is everybody who stays. Because remember, your goal is an effective company after the layoff, which means that for the ongoing performance of the company, the people who remain are just as important as everybody else. Then you may have customers. You may be a big enough or prominent enough company that you need to think about the press. When I did a layoff once, we wrote an internal memo announcing the layoff. That was intended to communicate both to people who were being laid off and to people who were not. And we gave that memo to the press as their way of seeing that our internal message and the external message was the same. And I'm going to bring Mike up again here because he's saying how it's done is a reflection on the business and the culture. Yes, all of these choices are values choices. When you are thinking about how to communicate something or how to do something, every choice can, if you have the time to do it, and I recommend spending some cycles on this, you may have some late nights, think as broadly as possible about, well, what does this choice say about what our culture is? Are we a company that prides itself on having a certain kind of a technical culture or on a certain composition of our workforce? And difficult decisions are the actions that determine culture. So you will be deciding your organization's culture by virtue of how you do this most difficult of decisions. And then my personal preference on how to do this is to focus on first on the people who are leaving. And so I try to plan to do one-on-one if possible, but if not, small group conversations as rapidly as possible, starting first thing in the morning. I've had cases where we had to lay off dozens of people and we were able to get it all done within 2 or 3 hours. The meetings are pretty short because there's not a whole lot to say. You explain to people what the reason is. Usually it's because of some economic issue. If they ask why me, you can always say, that whoever the leader is worked with the rest of the leadership team and made difficult decisions. Ideally, the leader who made the decision to lay that person off is the one in the room. I always insisted on personally taking part in those conversations, especially when I had made the choice about a person, because, Game of Thrones principle is like he who, passes the sentence swings the sword, or they who, she who, whatever pronoun you use. And then as soon you're doing it rapidly from the very first one, rumors are starting to spread. And so sometimes there's a pre-communication to the company of like, hey, you may be hear that layoffs are happening. You want to tell people that everybody who's been laid off has been contacted. And then some people will walk into the meeting knowing what's happening. It can't quite be perfect. It's a little easier actually in a Zoom world because there's not the same kind of office swirl. And then I recommend doing an all hands or whatever version of that you do in your organization for everybody who remains, where you take the opportunity to say, you have to acknowledge that oftentimes those layoffs come as a surprise because you can't communicate them in advance. You speak honestly as to whether there is the possibility of more layoffs coming. I would never say we won't do any more layoffs only to discover 2 months later that you have to. So you got to be really careful about that and be real with people of, we needed to have this much so that we could do this, or our investors asked us to, and we will need their capital in 2 months. Just be real with people about whatever it is, and then answer their questions and recognize that some of it is just you being there. Some of it is just you being available and present. And some of it is authentically answering their questions. And then, I generally recommend a process where you assist people in getting out of the building or wrapped up as quickly as possible the same day. Sometimes there are some ongoing transition tasks that are totally necessary, but those are best avoided if you possibly can. And then, the last thing I just say is I'd talk to others who have laid people off, because you will develop your own way of doing it. And one way to do that is by consulting with folks who have done that. So founders who we've invested in have often asked others. It's really challenging. This is hard. There's some no-nos to avoid. I guess this is really the last thing, which is talking about what a hard day it was for you. It's like, fuck you. No, it's not about how hard a day it was for you. It is about how difficult it is for everybody being laid off, and nobody cares how hard it was for you. If it is hard for you, which it is, I'm not saying that I don't care or you shouldn't care about yourself. That's a subject for your friends, or maybe some folks on your senior leadership team who share that difficulty, or if you have a coach with your coach or your therapist. That is not a burden. Showing that it's hard for you does not make it seem like you're more humane. It looks like an attempt for sympathy. And this isn't about your sympathy. It's about respect for professionals done quickly. So speed or respect, you can't choose one. All right, that's the question for today. We may talk about this and other difficult subjects. By the way, this is not code for any layoffs anywhere that I'm aware of. In fact, this is a time where lots of folks are trying to hire as rapidly as possible. So in a way, it's the best time to talk about this. And if you have more questions, ask them. You can find us anywhere on the internet. To be continued.